Two men in navy blue business suits came from my father. I didn't follow them into the bedroom. Efficient movers, these men. Shortly they came wheeling out a gurney bearing a cleanly pressed gray corduroy zipper bag. My father. Yet the bag looked so small. The men in blue pushed the gurney past me and went on out the front door. My youngest son, Kent, was with me. I grabbed his hand and held it like a small child's. This son, already nearly 40, standing taller than I by several inches. The high, white August sun shone brightly as the men in blue rolled the gurney with the small gray bag up to the back of a white van, the kind plumbers drive. They pushed the gurney inside and drove off. "Just like that," I said to Kent. "Just like that." That's how it ended my father's 92 years on this earth. Just like that. It was August 12th, 1992. I think my father would have liked the way it ended. No fuss, no flowers, no fancy show, no wailing, just a gray bag and the back end of a white van. And after that, life goes on. He had written an autobiography and ended it by speaking of May and his children. These four extraordinary individuals have taught me how to live and to love. They have stood by me through sickness and health. These beautiful people have made my life full, so full that sometimes I almost burst. I must have done something right. And I thought, yes, that was enough for any man. Winter in Laramie was like living in a wind tunnel, the temperature well below zero, the place unfriendly and bitter. When you stepped outside, you felt as if you'd been slapped in the face, the wind that strong and mean. I felt trapped in Laramie, as I later felt trapped in other towns. I had not yet learned that I dragged my trap with me. At that time, all I knew was I had to get the hell out. Out of the house, out from under my folks, out of Laramie, out. College and law school would have to come later. Right now, I had to escape. One night, about Christmas time, I announced at the supper table, "I'm getting the hell out of here." My parents didn't believe in argument. My father said nothing, just looked sad. My little brother and sister sat looking down at their plates. Why the hell couldn't somebody say something? My mother stared at her hands in silence. The next Sunday morning I announced that I was leaving. The semester was over. I decided to hitchhike to San Diego. My buddy Jim Brown and I were going to go to sea. "What about your graduation?" my mother asked, her eyes sad. But except for the first glance when she spoke, she didn't look at me. She had never mentioned that she'd wanted to attend my graduation ceremony. Never said that getting her son through high school was her day, too. Jim Brown didn't go for that brand of bullshit either. Made him sick, he said. He'd arrived in Laramie his junior year, a boy my age, and without parents. His father had died early of a stroke. His mother had died as well. Well, by God, Jim and I were buddies, and the two of us would get the hell out of school and seek our fortune. Jim was smarter than I, nice-looking kid, who knew what it was all about. He was going to be a lawyer, too. That Sunday my father had already gotten dressed for church, his old blue suit, his white socks showing, the same old shoes he'd worn to church for 10 years, a thin old-fashioned tie. My mother was wearing her same Sunday dress, the red one, and her straw hat with a feather in it. My little sister Barbara was all decked out in her curls and her new flowered dress my mother had made, and she wore thin baby blue ribbons in her hair. My little brother Tom was wearing a freshly pressed white Sunday shirt and his own clip-on bow tie. My mother tried not to say anything hurtful, but just the pain in her eyes told the story. My father was silent as usual. My mother had let me take the same old black metal suitcase we'd lugged to my grandparents when I was a child. She kissed me goodbye and told me to say my prayers, trying to say something else I could tell, but she couldn't get it out. I promised I'd write. I was in a hurry to get the misery of leaving over with. I said, "Dad, could you drive me out to the highway?" He looked at me surprised, and then he saw my suitcase standing there at the door, and he didn't say anything. He grabbed it and tossed it in the back seat and said, "Come on." Then he drove the old Ford to U.S. Highway 30, headed west. It was cold, and a high Laramie wind was blowing. At the edge of town, my father let me off. I shook his hand in the way a man shakes the hand of a man. I got out of the car with my bag, and I stood there on the road alone. Then he revved up the old Ford, made a big U-turn in the middle of the highway, and headed the car back toward home, me standing there in the wind and the blowing snow on the empty road. I turned to watch, and for the last time I saw the old Ford, saw it disappear down the street, its fenders still flapping. I turned my head into the wind and waited for something to throw my thumb at. I had $15 in my pocket. I wasn't going to starve to death. I could get work. But I was going to freeze my ass off if a car didn't come along and pick me up pretty quick. Then somebody did come. It was always that way for me. Somebody always came along to save me. That's the way it is for me, even today. 4 days later, I was in San Diego. California was a make-believe place, all warm and balmy in the winter, with palm trees, soft, wet air. How could there be such a place as this? I would never go back to Wyoming. I hoofed it up to the private school where Jim was staying, and he packed his bags, and that was it. The next day we signed on as messmen on the SS Roanoke, a scummy, derelict old tanker. No self-respecting seaman would think of boarding the Roanoke. Consequently, it was the only ship offering work to a first-time seaman. She was scheduled for Port Arthur, Texas, through the Panama Canal. Jim was assigned to the officers' mess and I to the crew's mess. The steward, a fat, rat-faced, black-haired Texan of about 50, was in charge of both dining rooms. He fed his men well, had to get anybody to stay on the Roanoke. The next morning I was awakened by a strange rumbling noise. I jumped out of my bunk and ran out on deck to see what was happening. The entire ship was vibrating. Suddenly I realized the Roanoke's old engines were thumping away down in the hold. Then I saw the deckhands working the lines, hauling the gangplank, and I heard the swish, swish, swish of the screw churning the water. And finally the old ship eased out backwards into the harbor, and we were sailors. Yes, sailors. "Well, here we go," I said to Jim. "Right," he said, a big grin on his face, his eyes all distant and squinty. And that's all he said. We sailed through the Panama Canal, and I loved the heat, the feel of sweat on my body, the warmth in the low, deep winter sun. The countryside was lush and green. It was a paradise out there, little jutting islands that pushed out of the ocean like green moss-covered stumps. Everywhere there were palms and clear, deep, calm water. Then one morning I was awakened by silence. The background rumble of the engines had stopped, nothing but the quiet slush of water against the tub's old iron sides. I stumbled out of my tiny bunk in the hold and ran to the poop deck to find the old Roanoke docked. Acres of oil tanks, refinery stacks in the distance, ugly place, barren of greenery, Port Arthur, Texas. That night we got drunk in the first saloon we could find, the steward, Jim, I, and the cook. Big time we were, smoking, and big time drunk on straight shots of Seagram 7 with a beer chaser. The saloon was soggy from wall to wall, in uproar and racket, with seamen plastered up against the walls and hanging like slabs of beef from the bar. The place smelled like 100 bottles of booze, and sweat and piss and cheap hair grease, and the musk of 100 foul-breathed men. We visited body houses in Galveston, then Jim and I retired to the poker houses and played the games with the big boys for the big money, sometimes $5 a throw. 5-card stud and draw poker. We sat at the round, green velvet-covered tables in the smoky back rooms, sat there straight-faced, looking mean, looking tough, smoking our big cigars, not talking, not looking up. I was inexperienced, but I was winning. Despite the unwritten law of poker players that prohibits the display of emotion, sometimes I couldn't contain my anger at the luck of the draw, and I would slam the cards down on the table in disgust and throw in the hand. At other times, after I'd sneaked a peek and was overjoyed at what I saw, I couldn't help but come out with a joyous, "Jesus Christ!" The old hands with those dried-up, brittle psyches thought I was bluffing, because no honest-to-God poker player is honest. The bluff is the essence of the game, the empty face. Poker is a game of lies, but to let the truth hang out? Not a veteran poker player, not even the houseman, understood the confounding power of the truth. Later in the courtroom, my seasoned opponents would saunter into court in their blue pinstripe suits and their pretty silk ties, these men of great intelligence who were steeped in the sauce of cynicism and soaked in the brine of distrust. But they were no better suited to understand the power of truth than were those tin-horn gamblers in Galveston. Between us, Jim and I won $20. Big night. We vacated the premises and swaggered on down the waterfront, grabbed a cab, and headed back to the ship.